The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello, it's me again, Lacey Bonar Hull, and I'm here with the second installment in the mini-series on rumor and gossip at the Tudor court. Today's episode is a continuation of our investigation into rumors concerning the Boleyn family at the court of Henry VIII. On the last episode in this series, I chatted with Dr. Kristen Bundesen about Mary Boleyn and her rumored relationship with the kings of both England and France. So if you haven't listened to it yet, be sure to check that episode out. Today, we'll be learning about the other two Boleyn siblings, Anne and George, and I'm excited to share that my guest on today's episode is Kate McCaffrey, an historian and assistant curator at Anne Boleyn's childhood home of Hever Castle in Kent. Kate recently graduated from her master's degree in medieval and early modern studies from the University of Kent, where her thesis focused on groundbreaking new evidence she uncovered in one of Anne Boleyn's printed books of hours, held at Hever Castle. She has just co-curated the Becoming Anne Connections, Culture, Court exhibition running this year at Hever, and has co-authored the accompanying book entitled Becoming Anne alongside Dr. Owen Emerson. Kate has some fantastic insight into the lives of Anne and George, especially concerning the rumor of an affair of incest between the two that led to the downfall of the Boleyn family. Let's begin. Hi, Kate. How are you?
Hi, I'm so good, thank you. It's lovely to be here with you. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on. So I am really excited to be chatting with you today about two of the most famous people at Henry VIII's court and two members of the Boleyn family. We're going to be chatting about Anne and George. So time's a little tight. I know there's a ton that we could talk about with the two of them. So let's just go ahead and jump right in, okay?
Okay, I'm ready.
All right. So what do we know about Anne and George's relationship before Henry VIII lodged any accusations against the siblings? Did they get along with one another and with others at Henry's court?
Okay, so I would say if we're summing up their relationship, we could just simply say that they were as thick as thieves. They were very close friends. We know that George is entrusted by both Anne and Henry as the message bearer for their courtship, which shows how much Anne trusted him. We know that Anne and George share a love of languages, religious reform, art, music, poetry. We have a wonderful text that survives with George's transcription and translation of a radical religious text. It's the Epistles and Gospels for the 52 Weeks of the Year by Jacques Lefebvre de Table. And he translated this for Anne, and he wrote a beautiful personalized introduction, dedication to the book, which I think actually gives a really good portal into George and Anne's close relationship. But, you know, he talks of himself there as her most loving and friendly brother. He speaks of their perpetual bond of blood. And there's something of a cheekiness as well in the dedication, I think, with George. He talks about Anne's meek fashion, which, of course, we know she was never particularly famed for. And then he's also sort of seemingly self-deprecating when he talks of the weakness of my dull wit, which, again, George was famed for his intelligence. So I think we see a real insight there, even in the seriousness of this translated text and their shared love of religious reform. We kind of see that tongue-in-cheek, brotherly, sisterly banter between them.
I love that. I think that gives you some great insight into more of like the personal relationship between the two of them. And I love how witty they both were, but especially George. I think it's fun to get a little bit of insight into his humor. So we know they were close with each other. Did they have pretty good reputations at court? I know Anne's was a little divided, I think, to say the least. But can you give us any information just on how the two of them would have been perceived by others at the court?
Yeah, so I think obviously the Boleyns at this time, during their rise to fame, they're quite controversial. Some people love them or hate them, probably as they do today. But I think, the outstanding research, for example, of Dr. Laura Mackay in her reappraisal of the Boleyn men, she sort of noted that George's career is almost somewhat hampered by being in Anne's shadow, I think, at times. So perhaps we have this idea of George willingly sacrificing his own advancement in order to aid his sister. So I think that probably may have been a perception of them both as well. I think they were definitely seen to be very close, but Anne was the shining star of the Boleyn family, and the others sort of let her be and helped her on her way.
Sure, that makes sense. And that's actually obviously kind of how things remain today, where when you think of the name Boleyn, you think of Anne first and foremost, for good reason. But I do like, trying to understand a little bit more how she fit in with her family, because the family itself is just fascinating, as you know well.
Yes, yeah, so fascinating.
Yeah, they are. Okay, so now we have to talk about that rumor. So what was the big accusation Anne and George faced in May of 1536?
Yes, so on the 2nd of May, 1536 is when Anne is arrested. She's arrested in the morning, and she's taken to the Tower of London in the afternoon. She gets there around 5 p.m. George is arrested in the afternoon of the 2nd of May, so after Anne, but he probably arrives at the Tower before her at around 2 p.m. And it's actually been suggested by the wonderful historian Claire Ridgway that George may have actually been trying to reach the king to petition for his sister when he himself was arrested. And we know that there was a lot of confusion initially around why they were arrested. Not even Eustace Chapuis, who is notoriously anti-Boleyn, could sort of account for why George had been arrested. And he simply believed that her brother is imprisoned for not giving information of her crime. So that's what it was initially thought. But what they were actually charged with was incest and adultery. So Anne was charged with adultery with 5 men, including her own brother. And that's what George was charged with. He was charged with incest. And I think when that charge of incest was revealed, it understandably, and as I believe it was meant to, sent huge shockwaves through the court. It's particularly sort of explicit and lurid accusations. And they specifically spoke of Anne alluring George with her tongue in his mouth and his and hers. And it was a charge, I think, completely and utterly meant to shatter Anne's reputation, but also annihilate the Boleyn faction at court.
Mm-hmm. Wow, yeah, it's quite a charge. It's one that I think was seen as being indefensible, that something so heinous had to be lodged against them to bring down such a powerful faction. And I think you speak to that really, really well. Now, this next question is probably one that I think most of us would agree on the answer to. But I do want to talk about this with you for a minute, just as our resident Anne specialist. So, do you think it's possible that this rumor had any basis in reality?
Okay, so I'm a firm believer, as I think, like you said, most of us today are, that it's almost certain that Anne did not sleep with any of the men that she was accused of betraying Henry with, including her brother George. We have lots of evidence. I mean, for example, the late and great historian Eric Ives, who is probably Anne's most famous biographer, he established that in at least 12 cases where Anne was accused, there was no literal possibility that she could have been with the men in question on those dates. She was completely in a different location for most of the dates that were detailed, which is astounding, really, that sort of basic facts like that were wrong. And I think sort of speaks to the fact that they knew what the decision was going to be. They didn't have to find evidence that was believable, really. But it's a particularly pernicious charge. I think it must have been so painful for both George and Anne to bear that, as they were so close, and also obviously for the rest of the Boleyn family as well. But perhaps it was their closeness and their obvious closeness as siblings that made it an easier charge to levy.
Yeah, it's interesting when you look at how flimsy at best, or really non-existent, the evidence is. But like you said, I think it was just an open and shut case that they knew what the verdict would be, and they knew that they didn't really have to worry about any sort of burden of proof. So that brings us to the next question that I don't know if you can actually answer this one, or maybe just kind of give us like your best guess. But so, do we have any ideas of where this particular rumor started and who might have been responsible for spreading it? And is it true that George's wife, Jane Parker Boleyn, may have spread this gossip at court?
Yeah, so this is obviously a really interesting question. I think Jane Boleyn, née Parker, she's obviously historically taken the blame for betraying her husband George and her sister-in-law Anne. But really, contrary to those claims, there's absolutely no contemporary evidence to suggest that Jane actually did betray them. There's a source that claims that Jane confessed on the scaffold after that she had betrayed her husband, but this was actually a forgery created in the 19th century by the prolific forger Gregorio Leti. And Eustace Chapuis never named Jane as Anne's accuser, and I think that's a really important point to consider when such a revelation coming from a close member of the family would have actually strengthened the case of Anne being guilty. You know, if her sister-in-law is clearly saying that her brother and her sister-in-law had been sleeping together, then you think that would have been mentioned in the evidence in terms of strengthening the case. We also know that Jane tried to visit George in the Tower. She tried to intervene on his part. And George himself never named his wife as an accuser. He states in his trial, "On the evidence of only one woman, you are willing to believe this great evil of me, and on the basis of her allegations, you are deciding my judgment." But you would think that if that woman was his wife, he would mention her name. And I think it's also an important question to consider that if Jane had betrayed her husband and also her employer, the Queen, why would Henry's subsequent Queen consorts have been so keen to have Jane in their service? Because we know that Jane served Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, and then obviously Catherine Howard. So there's all sorts of sort of interesting points, I think, but I really do think that we'll never know for sure probably who the woman that George Boleyn spoke of was, or really who the main accusers were. But I think when we look at all of the evidence, I don't think it could have been his wife, Jane. I think, she became an easy scapegoat in popular memory. She plays that kind of bitter, unloved wife trope, and is easy to blame her. But really, there's no sort of contemporary foundation for that whatsoever.
Okay, that sounds good. I like to try and dispel the myths around, especially some of these women in history that
yes.
I feel like they easily fall into that trope, like you said, that they're the villain or that they're the person responsible for the downfall of such a great family. When I think with Jane, I mean, her later role in the courts or on the in the employ of Henry's future queens, I think that speaks a lot to how it was doubtful that people at the time would have thought that she played a significant role in the charges against her husband and Anne. But also, I feel like she wouldn't have really had the power or the agency needed at the time to be able to just kick off this completely life-shattering set of accusations for so many people. I think what is more likely is that it would have been someone like Cromwell, who had the ear of the king and was very trusted, whether, he lodged these accusations at Henry's request or if it was, something more of his own doing. I think that is where you see a more likely scenario for the person who might have started this rumor against Anne and George, rather than someone who was in the Boleyn family who would have faced just significant ruin herself if she had been the person who had lodged these charges against them.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah,
I think Cromwell definitely is also who I would agree with as being, the orchestrator behind these events, whether acting alone or on the orders of Henry, or a combination of both. But I think certainly you can see his hand behind a lot of it.
I think so too. I think the combination of both, in my opinion, obviously as someone who's 500 years removed, if you're looking at sort of like the Occam's razor of it, where the most obvious answer is often the correct one. I think Henry and Cromwell teaming up is probably the most likely scenario. But it's interesting that so much blame does get laid at the feet of George's wife, and something that like the accusations against Anne, something that has really survived down the centuries is this negative reputation of Jake that I think a lot of people now are starting to say is not deserved. So thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, so we have our last question. So can you tell us a bit about the fallout from this rumor? So obviously Anne and George ended up losing their lives, but can you give us any information on what happened to the other Boleyns? So in particular, their parents, Thomas and Elizabeth, and their sister, Mary?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, like we just touched on, I think the orchestration of the accusations against Anne and George were an absolute political masterstroke by Cromwell, who really managed to wipe out the entire Boleyn faction at court pretty much overnight. So it's safe to say, I think, that the downfall of Anne and George was the death knell, really, of the Boleyns of Hever Castle. And here I have to shout out my great friend and brilliant colleague, Dr. Ern Emerson's book, which he co-wrote with Claire Ridgway, called The Boleyns of Hever Castle. And that looks at all the generations of the Boleyns here, including the aftermath of the executions. And we know that Thomas and Elizabeth retire here to Hever in the immediate aftermath of their children's downfall. Thomas is stripped of his duty as Lord Privy Seal in favour of Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell sort of continues to harass Thomas, really, who is no doubt still grieving himself. And over the next year, we see legal subsidies and rents, being begged to pay. And I think in the replies that Thomas sends to Cromwell, we can see really how much he is still grieving and how much he has really sort of become a broken man, obviously losing his two children and in what is the most horrific way possible, really. In terms of Elizabeth, his wife and Anne's mother, we know that she was unwell when Anne and George were arrested. And we know actually that Anne was worried in the Tower that her mother might die of grief. And those sort of fears proved to be astute, really, because Elizabeth died not 2 years later, on the 3rd of April, 1538. Thomas had no choice as well after the executions of his children to return to court life. He still had a family and households to support, but between duties such as being present at Prince Edward's christening, he chose to spend most of his time at Hever. And as Lauren Mackay stated, there appears to have been a reconciliation between Thomas and Mary, his daughter, which is really nice to see, because we know this because he left lands and property for Mary in his will when he passed away. We know obviously that Thomas had previously fallen out with Mary when she married William Stafford without familial or monarchical consent, but they do seem to have eventually reconciled. And it was at Hever that Thomas spent his final days. He died in the castle on the 12th of March, 1539. And I think it's quite moving, really, that the Boleyns died without any inkling that Elizabeth, Anne's only surviving child, would one day inherit the throne, and that Boleyn would become the Queen of England.
And that gives you goosebumps.
Just
to think that, I mean, in my opinion, Elizabeth is one of, if not the most successful monarch
absolutely
of the Tudor period. But I mean, really, if you're just looking at English history, it's hard to beat Elizabeth I. And yes. I think that her Boleyn ties, they're often minimized. And I think that's something that we're starting to see, like you've been mentioning in a lot of this recent scholarship, that it sort of needs to be rehabilitated. Elizabeth was a Boleyn. She came from the Boleyn family, and we know that she really valued those relationships that she had with her surviving Boleyn relatives, especially with Mary Boleyn's children in particular.
Exactly.
And it's just it's sad that Thomas and Elizabeth didn't get to see that sort of the culmination of the Boleyn family's power. But I also like what you said about Hever being sort of like a refuge for Thomas, because we so often, Thomas is discussed as being, like a callous man, someone who was just seeking after power and used his daughters especially to try and achieve power. And I don't think that was the case. And I think you speak really well to that in talking about the aftermath of Anne and George's death for Thomas and Elizabeth, but especially, Thomas, that he was still expected to hold these roles at court. And I mean, he knew better than anyone else that you don't cross Henry and you don't try and challenge him at all. If he tells you that you have to be at the christening of his son, you have to be at the christening of his son. You don't really have
You don't say no.
No, you don't.
Exactly.
You don't say no to Henry. No. And Thomas knew that. And I think for a lot of people, they take that as being a sign that he just shrugged off the death of his two just beloved children. I mean, you can tell that how proud he was of them and how much time how he cared about them as a father, and to know that he had to balance the role that was expected of him at court with his role as a grieving father. It's just, I think it's really touching to think about that side of Thomas, and to know that Hever did sort of serve as a place where he could go to try and escape it all for the couple of years that he had left.
And I think it's a really touching echo, really, of how Anne used Hever, to escape court and escape the madness of court during her rise to power. She would come back here and use it as that country escape. And I think Thomas very much used it in a similar way as a refuge after the death of Anne and George. And I think, you're so right that it's really important that we don't just take the traditional narrative of him as the villain for granted, and we don't just take that without questioning it. And a lot of wonderful scholarship has been done recently to sort of change our perspective of that. And I think absolutely we have to remember he was a grieving father as well as, a politician.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a good place to end. Thank you so much, Kate, for coming on and talking about these rumors, and I feel like really dispelling any notion of truth behind really any of the rumors that have been lodged against the Boleyn family. I think it's a good conversation to have. It's a meaningful one. And thank you so much for being the person to discuss this with me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to dispel these myths.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Tudors Dynasty Podcast. You can follow and support the Tudors Dynasty Podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Patreon @Tudors Dynasty.